This is the fun part, sweetheart.
Hello and welcome to the All Good Stories podcast, where we believe all good stories belong to Jesus. And when we look for Jesus in the stories around us, we find him more fully in our own. We're your hosts, Chris Bowden
and Simon Campbell, two millennial dads who love pop culture and making connections from the content we love to the God who loves us.
And in episode 13, another edition of All Good Stories After Bedtime, we've got cows as we chase down the good stories in Twister. All right, Simon, welcome to another rendition of All Good Stories After Bedtime, an opportunity for us to talk about the movies that we love to watch after the kids have gone to bed.
We've got everything locked down for the night. We're ready to go.
We've got popcorn and maybe some adult beverages. We're ready to relax.
Yes.
And I'm really excited to jump into Twister. Not Twisters, but Twister. This is a movie we wanted to snag because it's pretty relevant right now, because the sequel, many, many years later, Twisters, has released. And I had the opportunity to go see Twisters here recently, which I loved. And as soon as I got home, one of the first things I wanted to do was go watch the original and see both how it stacked up, or what's comparative, what's the same, what's different. Because I realized I just didn't remember it all that much, but I was so re-inspired to jump back in. And as I talked to people who also had seen this movie, it seemed like everyone has some kind of meaningful memory attached to Twister. It seems like one of those really culturally relevant or just really familiar movies, especially for all these Midwestern kids in Iowa where we hail from.
Who experience tornado watches, warnings, and storms.
Tornadoes are a very, very real thing. It's not just Hollywood for us. But notably for you, Simon, as we talked about this, in the midst of me saying that, everyone seems to have a memory with Twister, you are not one of those people.
No, I am not. This is a new story for me. But I think anytime you have a good story, a good movie that has stood up to this number of viewings and obviously has been brought back for a remake or a sequel, those are good stories to engage with. And it was a fun one for me.
That said, this movie took place all the way back in, the olden times of 1996.
96.
So if you could help us dial back the clock and remind us, what is Twister, singular, all about?
Twister is about storm chasers Dr. Joe Thornton and Bill Harding, and they're on a high-stakes mission to study and understand tornadoes in order to improve warning systems and save lives. Along with their eccentric and ragtag storm chaser friends, their journey takes them through a series of increasingly intense and destructive tornadoes in the heart of Tornado Alley in Oklahoma. While they are navigating these dangerous storms, Bill and Joe have to confront their stormy past relationship and a hostile rivalry with the competing storm team. With thrilling action and heartfelt moments, this story shows the awesome power of storms and the mark they leave upon those who live through them.
It is now an official expectation that every time you provide a synopsis, I need some sort of dad joke reference attached inside. That's excellent. Thanks, man, for that reminder. All right, we could talk about just a little bit of movie magic, things we love geeking out over, talking about that we think help make this a good story in general. And as we dive into this, I do want to take a moment to talk about how this movie came together. And buckle up, because the production of this movie was a disaster. What
do you mean?
It was a rough ride to get this movie made. Joss Whedon, who later goes on to direct the Avengers movie many, many years later, was brought in to rewrite this script as it was coming together, but he got bronchitis. And so then another screenwriter, Steven Zaliam, was brought in until Whedon got better through the start of shooting. But then Whedon left the project after he got married. So you may be noticing like a problem here on the front end. And then 2 weeks into production then, as a result, this thing is rolling now. They bring in yet another screenwriter, Jeff Nathanson, who's been flown out to the set and worked on the script until the principal photography ended. So you've got this shuffling of screenwriters already trying to make this script happen, even as they're already starting production. And then we get to the actual actor's experience. And so halfway through filming, Bill Paxton and Helen Hunt, the leads in this movie, were temporarily blinded by the bright lights used to make the sky look dark and stormy, to create all these contrasts in the lighting. And Bill Paxton said, quote, "They literally sunburned our eyeballs." And
Oh my goodness.
they needed eye drops and special glasses for a few days for their eyes to heal and get back to normal until they could start shooting again.
Whoa.
And then they had to create a special lens to put on those because they need to continue to use those lights to get the effect they needed. But in order to prevent blinding their leads, they had to come up with some sort of production solution. And then these same two, when they were filming the first tornado, which is down in that like muddy ditch there off to the side of a field, the ditch they were filming in ended up being so unsanitary while they were hanging out in that they both need to get hepatitis shots. Not good. And then Helen Hunt suffered 2 head injuries. Poor Helen Hunt. One was in that same ditch. She hit her head on a beam of the bridge that they were under. She came up after shooting, just nailed her head. And then while driving through the cornfield away from the F5 tornado towards the end, they're holding the doors open before they're about to like jump out of the truck. And she let go of that door for a second and it slammed back in and hit her in the head. And most people on the set were like, yeah, she probably got a concussion. Like this was a real serious deal.
Even watching that scene with the corn and the opening doors, I'm like, oh, that's going to be harder than it looks. I almost expected her character not to be able to do it, and there would have to be some kind of like, she would almost get sucked in. You know what I mean? Like
any of those scenes in the cornfield, I was just like, I don't think people realize just how weird cornfields are, right? Like those stalks are hefty. And then once they jump out and they're like, oh, we're going to run to the barn. I'm like, there's no way. If anyone has detasseled, you don't know where anything is. You have no reference. You're blind in that field.
Where's the surface?
The writers were never in a corn maze. They don't know.
You never had a moment of terror while you were in a cornfield working in the summer going, well, hope this is the way out. And then on top of that, bad weather meant they had to keep pausing filming. They filmed on location, on site in Oklahoma, as the director advocated for, which I think is really cool. But they had to keep pausing because of the actual weather in Oklahoma that they were trying to film. So they had real hail, real lightning, floods, tornadoes, mud issues. And it was reported along the way as a result of that, the director was out of control. And at one point knocked down a camera assistant, which caused the rest of the crew to walk off the set.
Ooh.
So director did not really help things in the process here. And then on the other side of that, Jack Green, who is the cinematographer, the head photographer of the film, he had to then find like a new crew solution for the movie. And then he went on to get injured on set when Meg's house, it was hydraulic and designed to collapse on cue, was activated by mistake while he was inside the house. And he was hospitalized. The ceiling came down on his head. It injured his back. And required the director to take over as the director of photography for the rest of filming.
Oh my goodness.
And then to put the icing on the cake. At the end of all that filming, which again was on location in Oklahoma, the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, which then caused the shooting to get suspended while the cast and crew helped with relief efforts in Oklahoma City.
Wow.
And then, due to the delay in all of that shooting, when they came back to finish up the film, the seasons had changed in Oklahoma, which meant that the scenery just looked drastically different, and their shots were not going to align from when they shot it earlier in the movie and when they're shooting now. So the filming was moved to Iowa.
Okay, I was wondering where this little trail was leading. I was like, that looks a little too much like Iowa corn to me.
You got it. You absolutely nailed it. Got a little bit of Field of Dreams vibes here at the end of Twister. And the reason is because the scene at the end in the climax of the movie with the F5 tornado, that was shot entirely in Eldora, Iowa. And the cornfield that Joe and Bill are running through to the barn at the end after they jump out of the truck, that was filmed in a cornfield located near Ames, Iowa as well. So, again, for you and me, Iowa boys who were born and raised and live here now, I was surfing through some movie details and went, oh yeah, that's making it in the notes. But all that to say, this movie was budgeted at $70 million to make. All said and done, actually cost probably, it's projected at $92 million to make after delays in production and realities of how to make all of this happen. But it made $41 million in just its opening weekend and went on to make $241 million domestically and $252 million internationally for a total of $494 million, which is over 5 times its budget of what it cost to make. So you put all the right elements together, man.
There you go.
Still a moneymaker there at the box office for you.
Yeah.
But surprisingly enough, at least to me, when you jump on Rotten Tomatoes and look at this movie, it is only a 66% on Rotten Tomatoes for critics And it is even lower for audiences with an audience score of only 58%. And most of the consensus there is because it emphasizes effects over real characters. Felt like everybody in this movie is pretty one-dimensional, which might have some credit to that. And then felt like it was a pretty generic plot. And again, I look at that and go like, yeah, but I don't think that's why we're here to watch Twister.
Or it may have something to do with the fact that you had 4 screenwriters trying to piece this thing together.
Also might be helpful in the context of production. That's right. Talk about a ride to get there and then still delivering in the box office. And what I think is really cool is that even amidst what would look like low scores of reviews online, this movie is still a powerhouse in the box office and still, I believe, a powerhouse in kind of like Americana movie culture in our minds. So I think this movie, in a lot of ways, feels timeless. It feels connected to who we are culturally as people, maybe as Americans. Like, you look at Midwestern cornfields and tornadoes and you kind of go, home.
And I do think that there's something that resonates with those of us that live in these parts of the country. You know what it feels like when you come out and the temperature drops in those severe storms and like this strange, almost ethereal feeling. I personally have not lived through a tornado touchdown, but know enough people who have. They are common enough that we're all in driving distance of multiple touchdowns in the last handful of years.
My last few details here of movie magic that I just love nerding out over is that they used the real town of Wichita, Oklahoma, that served as the town that Meg the ant lived in, that they all stayed and hung out at.
Okay, yep.
And during filming, they used an older section of town that was actually demolished for the scene. It was like an older part of town. They were willing to like destroy the place and make it look like an F4 tornado had devastated the town. And the location was chosen after filming scouts discovered leftover debris from like a major hailstorm that occurred earlier, like years earlier, and was still there.
Yes, yeah.
And then because they were in the actual town of Wichita, a lot of the local residents of that town signed up as extras and were paid like $100 a day to be the people like in the background, in the town. It feels like one of those cool local legend stories that came out of this.
Well, I feel like if you're going to destroy part of their town, the least you could do is pay the people living there a few $100 to show up.
Yeah, isn't that a wild thing, though? Like, they're like, hey, we've got this part of town that's kind of either not being used, abandoned, run down. Like, I don't know what the story is there, but to hear that they said, hey, here's this older part of town, do what you want with it for your movie, that I don't think I've ever heard of that before.
That is very unique.
And then this movie starts to be a bit of a turning point in starting to combine CG animation alongside real practical effects. We have CG created tornadoes that are alongside practical effects like hail, glass shattering, and
flying tree limbs.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're getting the early end where you can see what's computer generated, while at the same time getting the practical effect of what's actually flying at them on screen that they have in practical. You can see enough of that difference here. And so that's really cool to see, like, hey, this is one of those first movies that's really trying to lean into that and own that and finding the right balance between those elements. And so in the midst of that, some cool notes when Bill and Joe's characters are trying not to be sucked up into the tornado at the end of the movie. They are floating in midair. And what they did to pull that off was the pipes were attached to a ceiling and they hung off straps from the ceiling. And then they just flipped the shot in post to make it look like they were floating in the air, and then did graphic effects above to show a tornado. Then when you get to some of the more practical effects, the crew used a Boeing 707 airplane engine things to generate wind in the film that was going to blow things hard enough the way that they needed.
Yes.
And then another practical effect that was then mixed in with CG effects was they had pickup trucks that were often following all of the actors' vehicles that they were driving at all times to either throw debris out of the back of the truck at them.
That's the job I want.
Right,
I want to just be chucking stuff.
They were throwing ice pieces to simulate hail that were made with ice machines that had to be imported from a different state because Oklahoma didn't have any.
No ice in Oklahoma.
No, there's no ice in Oklahoma. These are the fun production notes when you dig into the internet or Reddit threads where you're like, you gotta be kidding me. And then the last one I think is really fun is they used actual helicopters to drop the trucks and tractors on the road. So in the midst of all of this happening as they're driving through in these scenes, as these cars are driving on the road, there were helicopters above waiting to
That's
just
amazing.
let go of these
Yeah,
trucks.
yeah.
Which now, when you think about that, you're not spending the time, energy, coordination to do that in real life, I don't think, in Hollywood. That is 100% computer generated, right? We've got the technology to just make that digital. And at the same time, though, I feel like we are losing something in movies when we don't have the practicalness of those effects. As much as I love and appreciate what we're able to do, like, don't get me wrong, when it comes to digital effects, there's something, even when watching a movie made in 1996, your brain just knows that this probably isn't real, but that is a real truck that's dropping on the road. And that adds to the element of realism. I just think this is another, like, cool inflection point as a movie to go like, oh, we're figuring out how this works. And I will continue to advocate till the day I die, probably, that Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest will forever be the movie that perfectly combines CG elements with practical set pieces.
Shall we seal it in blood? I mean, ink.
You heard it here first, folks.
Man.
There it
that
goes.
Is the pinnacle of cinematography for me. Like, that is the right combo. That is the right tension between the two. All right, so let's talk about what belongs to Jesus. We believe that in all stories that are good, stories that are trying to tell us something good, that Jesus exists in these narratives, in these stories, that we can learn something about who he is and his character and his story when we watch these films in a way that helps us better see him in our everyday lives. And so we're just going to take a little bit of time to just talk about what we think uniquely belongs to Jesus in Twister.
Yeah, and the first one of those for me, the first reminder of Jesus in this is you get this overt reference to God when they're talking about the F5 tornado. When they're in Meg's house and they're all joking, telling stories, swapping stories. They talk about an F3 and what that's like, and they had some name for it. They said, oh yeah, an F4 will very efficiently relocate your house for you. And then everybody's tone hushes and they refer to an F5 tornado as the finger of God. Because of its massive power and because of its unpredictability and volatility. It's a unique place where you kind of sense the divine significance almost, or symbolism that's going on in this. And because that was the type of tornado that took Joe's father, that has put her on this path and on this journey, I think that those types of things are intentional in stories like this. Because when you have these sort of act of God storms, when the power and the incredible force of them are just so large that we cannot do anything but, attribute some divine significance to them, I think that that's a place that certainly mirrors language we see in Scripture. There's some common ones like Luke 8, when Jesus calms the storm and demonstrates mastery over the wind and waves, right? And everything goes calm, calm. And Psalm 107 predicts that moment in Psalm 107 in verses 28. It's a prophecy of that moment of Jesus. And there's also this passage in Nahum. Not often do we get to go to Nahum, but here we go.
Let's go to church, okay.
I think that this is a place where a lot of people's mindset about storms and God's relationships to storms, this is a verse that I think represents that. It's chapter 1, verse 3. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. I think that lots of times, for better or for worse, we interpret those storms as a sign of God's wrath, unfavor, punishment. And some of these disasters call into question, like, why would God do this? Why would God let this happen? And so I think when we see that F5 tornado referenced as the finger of God in this, and we have this backstory with Joe's character, I think that that's a representative place. There's rich things to talk about here, but I do think that the storms is a symbol of God's power, at the very least, is a place of connection with this story.
Yeah, we don't get a lot of, say, secular references to God in our world. There aren't a lot of places in our everyday lives where we get a direct reference to God as a either character, person, reference, but we still do in the world of insurance. Where there are literally in insurance policies, they talk about act of God. And it's large enough in scale, in power, in scope, that we have no other way to describe this besides
Yes.
saying it's
No
an act of God.
category.
And we're not trying to say that there's like a judgment factor here or the theology of why these
Right.
natural disasters
Right.
happen, but just acknowledging that there is a certain sense of raw power and awe that we find in weather that we often don't find in other places. We
Yes.
get a reminder of just how small we are, how little control we have, what we don't understand in this movie in particular is what makes me think of
Yes.
that. The big part of this movie is that we don't understand how tornadoes work, and we want to learn. We want to figure it out so we can help people. And for me, when I encounter weather or nature, those are great opportunities for me to be reminded of how big and great and grand God is. Whether it's pulling from the Psalms, when I actually go to a beach and I see all the grains of sand and I go, wow, that's a lot of detail that God has designed. Or see how great and big storm waves are, or you see how great and large mountains are, or you see the power of a tornado or a hurricane or a high-speed windstorm. You go, wow, that's all stuff that God designed and that God is greater than. And I ultimately have no influence or power up against that at all.
Yes.
You get a picture of like this really healthy fear, I think, of how good and great God really is. Not in a way that should cause us to project some negative impressions of his character, who he is, but just acknowledge the greatness, the grandness, and the power that he actually holds.
Anything like that causes us to realize just how small we are in the grand scheme. That recognition of our place in creation,
Yeah, it's
like
a
that
humbling thing.
Yes. And when I think of that passage in Luke or the other Gospels, when Jesus calms the storm and everything goes, as the Greek says, calm, like super calm, instantly calm.
Is that
right?
what that is?
Yes.
Oh, that's so great.
It's the word repeated, as in the water went still. Imagine that scene and what they're trying to describe. The impressive majesty of the storms is a symbol of God's power, but mastery over it. That's what truly terrifies, right?
It's not the storm. It's the reality of like, oh, you made all that stop.
Wow. And I think another place that belongs to Jesus really is the tension of why these storms happen. And I think that this is an opportunity for a spiritual conversation within Twisters as well, because one line that I really grabbed onto watching through this was Joe is in a tense moment with Bill, and she's saying, "You've never seen it miss this house and that house and come after you." Like the storm is chasing her. Like the storm is coming after her. She lost her father. She nearly lost Meg. And wrestling with this idea, is the storm chasing me? And with this F5 tornado being the finger of God, it's not directly asking this question, but I think you can make a case that it's asking the question, does God send these storms? Does he allow them? Why? It's something of a mystery. It's something of a tension.
It's an age-old question. Why do bad things happen? Why does God allow this to happen to me?
And particularly storms that have such a classic reference to God's wrath, to God's power, right? God sends storms in the scriptures. But what I would say is that when we're talking about the complexity of this, I don't want to oversimplify an answer, right? Because you can point to moments in scripture like in Jonah where God sends the storm to bring Jonah back. God sends the storm in the Luke chapter 8 to demonstrate his power, his mastery.
Sometimes we will oversimplify why we think a storm has occurred. It's either like an A or B, right? We can often think of like either I'm good or I'm bad, or God likes me or God doesn't like me. And what we find in scripture is that God will use whatever means necessary to get our attention and to demonstrate his purpose, his power, or to move his mission forward in the world. And it's rarely ever just like a, you're bad, and so here's a storm.
And I think that it's really important to understand something deeper about when storms happen, when anything negative happens. We may not always be able to understand and make a direct correlation, a cause and effect as to why. But one thing we can be sure of is that regardless of how adverse our circumstances are, God can and does and will and promises to use those things for good. So we see that despite Joe's tragedy that we see in the opening scenes of this movie, this tragedy of losing her father drove her to relentlessly, obsessively focus on studying tornadoes and developing these tools to measure and increase the understanding for more warning over and over again. The mission is you have to do it so that others would have warning, so that others might be saved. then that just reminds me a couple places in the Bible where we deal with these adverse circumstances, these difficult things, these storms. Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, when you slap that on a coffee cup, that makes it sound like, oh, everything works out for people who love God. That's not what it says.
It can, in a really unhealthy way, become
Yes.
the everything happens for a reason, which
Yeah.
like you throw out there into someone who's actually going through grief. You're like, cool, thanks.
That simplistic interpretation falls short of our actual experience.
Yes.
But what the scripture is saying, and in the context that it's in, is saying that in all things God works. So not in everything, but in all things. In all things God works. So in the larger context, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he's talking about how all of these present sufferings that the people of the Roman church are facing, that he is facing, that God is working these things for good, and they don't compare to the glories that are coming. And so I think that we can place our trust in that. Philippians 1, verse 12 is, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, Paul is writing this again, that what has happened to me, he's in prison at this time, possibly facing death, what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And so when we look at adverse circumstances, it's going to be very difficult at times when we're in the middle of these storms to understand maybe why. But what we can do is when we trust God, when we live into our calling according to his purpose, he will use those storms. He will use all things for the good of those who love him.
And what that made me think of, for the church that you and I belong to, we partner with an organization that responds to natural disasters. So we've got a lot of people in our church who have firsthand experience of the aftermath of a tornado, of going and responding and being present in a lot of the same ways that these people do in Twister, in Wakita. They show up. And we have story after story of people who have been through what is arguably one of the worst moments of their lives. Either they've lost their home, they've lost all their possessions, at worst, they've lost family members. And we do consistently encounter people who say yes to a relationship with Jesus and find Jesus for the very first time in the midst of or on the other side of that event. And it's just an affirmation for me of like, God will use all things as an opportunity to draw people back to himself, whether that is the people who've experienced it or the people who are responding secondhand, people who go and serve and that come back changed because they've seen how God can work in tragedy.
Yes.
And because they've been a part of administering or representing some of his love in their circles and communities. And I truly think about what in these disasters and tragedies get people's attention or hearts in a way that nothing else will. And you got to be careful with that because that can sound calloused or kind of weird. But if I believe that God is going to use all things, I can look at some of these disasters and events that happen in our world and have some sort of hope in my heart to go, how's God going to use that? What opportunity does this create? So that then in my own life, when tragedy occurs, I kind of have this radar to go, okay, God, what are you doing? God, what are you up to? What door is this going to open up that didn't exist earlier? In the same way that joy and life change causes opportunity, grief and life change is opportunity as well in a very different way. And God will use all those things all the time.
And those are really important things and really hard things to remember, hold on to, hope in while they're happening. But it is a really beautiful thing when you see the sort of senseless and dizzying destruction that happens as a result of these disasters met with the senseless and almost incredulous kindness of people who love Jesus.
And I think for those of us who love and follow Jesus, that is often us at our best, is to step into the gap, is to step into the mess, to step into the, I don't know what to do, and I don't know how this is going to go, but I'm going to be there. And I may not know what to say, I may not know what to do, but I'm going to be present, and I'm going to be attentive to what God's doing and the opportunity that God might create for someone to grow a little bit, to take a step, to see something in a new way. And what's connected to that for me is these moments in Twister where Joe and Bill have these consistent moments of this is it, where it's Dorothy 1, and then this is it when it's Dorothy 2, and then this is it when it's Dorothy 3. And of course, like any movie does, we got to get up to the last one, our last option. This is the last
just
thing.
Tell me how many you had from the beginning, then I'll know how many we'll go through.
That's right. How many times we're going to see the scene repeated. And they go through all of these setbacks or hardships that are disappointing, or you gear up to think like, this is the moment, this is the thing I've waited for, this is the thing. And then it's not. And there's kind of this like, oh, we got to reassess and we got to keep going. But in the end, you needed all those previous experiences to make you ready for this one.
Yeah, because they didn't have the little tin attached to the sensors.
That's right. They didn't have the little Pepsi
Because that was really going to do it.
Yeah, those aren't going to get ripped off in the tornado. No. This will be fine. But all that to say, it made me think of how many times in our own lives or in the Bible do we have stories of people who face multiple personal challenges where they probably consider this is it. This is the end. Either I have arrived or I'm at my rock bottom and I don't have to worry from here. This is it. This is the end. And then the story keeps going. And you realize later in the story that you needed kind of all these previous experiences and encounters to ultimately do the larger work that God wants to do, or he's going to continue to do that work in the journey. I think of Joseph in the Bible, I think is a story that's similar to this, where the guy was sold into slavery. He ends up second in command to Pharaoh and then ends up enduring all of these challenges along the way in that story, ultimately to provide not only for Egypt, but for his own people and his own family. In Genesis, it's like, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what's now being done, which is the saving of many lives. So I don't want to stretch those things too far or too close together.
Sure.
But the theme for me is that you're going to have these moments in your life where it's like, this is it. Here we go. I got it. And then it's like, crap, we got to reset.
Yeah.
We got to keep going. We got to do that again. But at our best, we're going to learn from those experiences of our past to inform those moments where we're going to be able to step in and potentially save many lives. The last thing I see that belongs to Jesus is really this idea of relationships and people being what matters. We get this great contrast in these two storm chasing teams where we get Jonas set up as the character who says like, yeah, he's sold out, basically. He's got corporate sponsors and he's not doing it for the science, he's doing it for the money. And then we've got this other team of people who are doing this for the science. Or ultimately, you actually find out they're doing it for the people that could be saved as a result of this.
Yes.
And you get these two great diverging paths here where the corporate sponsor team, they feel much more cold. Literally, they've designed it that way in the movie.
Yes.
There is a lack
all black
of
vehicles. Yes.
yeah, looking real cool. But there's this gap of relationship. There is not this internal driving motivator about people that I think we see contrast best when this team like takes a break for food at Meg's house.
Yes.
You see them have a meal together. You see them talk about life together. You get memories of their past experiences and adventures together. And for me, it's just a reminder of how valuable having real, authentic community where adventures can occur, where crazy stories can occur, where mistakes can occur, where even relational tension and fighting and having to sort things out like a family would together is really, really valuable. And that's going to be the motivator and game changer. I think that makes such a huge difference for us as followers of Jesus, to have people in our lives who are moving in the same direction towards the same mission with the same heart about what it is that Jesus wants to do in me and around me, that helps me move forward towards that when it's great and it's funny and we're celebrating and having fun, and when it's hard. I think about the hardships of that team and having to rally together and move forward out of Wakita or a disaster. And then I see the contrast of Jonas and that team having other concerns and him being like, no, just drive. I don't care. Just do it. Do the thing you have to do. And then they die.
Well, and you see that represented in that last moment where Joe and Bill are willing to lay aside even their ultimate ambition because they're in position and warn them that it's going to come back into them.
And you get the line from the guy who ultimately eats it with a metal bar through the windshield. Woof. He says they wouldn't lie to us. They have established a certain kind of relational trust even for the people on the other team. And so ultimately, I believe we serve a God that's all about relationships. Everything we're doing is about building relationships with other people in the same way that he's built and established a relationship with us. And so much opportunity, not just growth for us personally, but growth for God's kingdom when we have a team that is ragtag and messy and sometimes kind of weird, that we get to rally around together and say, hey, we are not alone in this mission. We are not alone in this pursuit. And what we're pursuing is not just about us. it is for the greater good of these other people that we want to save and care about. And that is a much better and greater motivator for us than just money or, corporate profit.
So the last thing I think I see in this story that belongs to Jesus is the role that both Joe and Bill face in the final encounter with Dorothy 4, the F5. They're facing this storm's wrath. Joe is facing an F5 for the first time since she lost her father. Everything is coming to its culmination here.
We are, wouldn't you know it, right back where we started for her story.
Right back where we started, yes. So,
let's take a moment real quick in the midst of right back where we started. What frickin' murder shed did they wander into at the end of this movie? I'm going to need to take some tangent time here. You're not telling me we could have this great side plot horror story that happens? Can you imagine if they turned this on a dime and were convincing this is like a disaster movie and they wander into some like crazy murder shed with all these farm tools?
With the scythes, yeah.
And then did you notice once they came outside and the F5 had blown through, what was left? They literally called it out. They said, left the house, which is one of the scariest houses I have ever seen in my life. You look at that thing and you go, oh yeah, that's definitely what they've been using all those tools in the shed for. Like that's where it all goes down.
They were just preparing for a spin-off, and that never came to be. You're creating a setting
for
the
elements are there. Apart from like the random cutaway shot to the family that made it after the storm, they like get out of the cellar and you're like, oh look, closure from Joe's story. Other than that, I'm looking at all these elements kind of floating out there and I go, something's going down on that farm. That is not a safe place to stay.
And at the same time, it's like you didn't need anything more scary than the fence slats coming through the wall of the barn.
It's like
that's scary enough. Why do you need scythes hanging there that don't come into play
You thought
later?
It was going to be all the blades. No. Watch out for the pickets.
So as we're coming back into this culmination of this story, they're facing the F5 tornado. Bill and Joe have this decision to make, whether they are going to risk essentially everything to face the wrath of this storm, to seek to get the sensors in there to learn from this tornado, to be able to warn and save those from this type of storm's fury in the future. I think in that moment, to face the wrath of this storm, we get a little Jesus moment where I think is an opportunity to talk about how Jesus has faced the storm of God's wrath for us. Jesus entered the tempest, the storm of God's wrath, because the storms have, throughout the scriptures, throughout the Old Testament, oftentimes have been a symbol of God's wrath. And Jesus is the one who stills the storms. Jesus is the one who takes the storm for us so that we might be spared. And so I think when we see Bill and Joe enter that storm, really even enter into the center of that tornado and endure its wrath so that others might be able to avoid that same experience, that to me is a place that reminds me of Jesus. I think it's an opportunity to say, oh, hey, Jesus faced that storm for us.
Yeah. There's a willingness to put my life on the line, to sacrifice everything for these other people.
Yeah. And even lose a truck with just liability insurance on it.
And now it's time for some Love It or Leave It. An opportunity for us to talk about what we loved and what we could have done without along the way. And Simon, I've got to jump in here because my very first Love It or Leave It for you is the one, the only, Carrie Elwes being an actor in this movie. Wesley from The Princess Bride, no less, who gets to play Jonas, the closest version to a villain that we have in this movie.
It's great. The only thing that's so jarring for me that I could probably have left it was the juxtaposition of his character being associated with Wesley, but this Oklahoma accent. of the
accent's the deal breaker for you here?
I can't I don't know. It's hard for me to believe. I don't think he does a particularly bad job of it or anything like that. It's just like, something doesn't belong here. And you're supposed to you're Wesley. Why are you trying to be, who are you?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm getting mixed reviews from you here, man. You're like, I have no problem with this. And then you went, why are you here? What are you
Okay, I love that he's in it, but I could leave the accent. So mixed reviews. Okay, love it or leave it for you. Dorothy as the name for this device. Is that ever explained? I don't.
Oh man, that is a love it. That's a reference from the
Why?
Wizard of Oz. Dorothy gets sucked into a tornado to go to
all
the
right.
land of Oz.
I see. So Dorothy. Okay, I got it.
She's not in
Okay.
Kansas anymore, man. She's
Thanks for
she's
helping
flown the
me with
tornado.
that. I didn't make that connection at all. So like when they're naming this, I was like, why? If that's not going to be explained as, some other character connection, but it's just, okay.
This is
I gotcha.
probably not
Yeah.
spoiler. This is just a cool element in the Twisters movie, is
Okay.
that the new devices they're using to read tornadoes in this movie, they need 3 of them in order to triangulate reading a tornado. And it
Okay.
is Scarecrow, Tin Man, and Lion are what these
Oh, there
devices
you
are
go.
called. And so it's
Okay.
this great little
Okay.
homage callback to Dorothy, this
Okay.
original device. Probably one of my favorite questions I'm going to ask you. Love it or leave it. The just excessive amount of debris that they find to throw around in this movie.
I do love it. I do love it because even what you were talking about with the movie magic of helicopters dropping, it's like I can tell that's real farm implements coming down.
And how great was that?
It's great.
Like those are combine after combine.
Yes.
They're dropping on this
Yes.
road. And for me, that's one of my favorite parts of the movie because you reach a point where it feels excessive, but you're not mad about it, right? And
Yep.
so my question for you is, do you have a favorite moment or favorite
Yeah,
piece of flying
I do.
debris in this movie?
I do. My favorite, well, because I think in the drive-in movie theater when it rips off the screen and the part of the projection's still there. I was like,
Yes.
oh, okay, that's cool.
That is a super cool one to call out. The fact that it's The Shining on the screen as well is just even better. My favorite one is right towards the climax of the movie. They're running through the field, getting to the second barn that they're trying to hide in, and everything on the farm is flying by them in the moment, and all you catch that flies above their head that they have to drop down towards is the front of a combine. It comes swinging down above their heads,
Yeah.
and it's the twirling blades of the
Yeah.
combine. And for me, it's so aggressive and so sudden, where I'm like, oh my gosh, can you imagine that? They probably wouldn't have seen that in real life, would have lopped their heads right off, right here at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
And that'd have been it.
Yep.
All done. Killed by tractor.
Yeah.
But that was one of those where
Well,
it just comes out
yeah.
of nowhere. I went, oh, we're like the tension's high, the energy's there. We're going to throw yet another tractor right over their heads there. That's like, oh, that's a fun one.
Love it or leave it, the ending of this movie. Just the resolution. I think they said, oh, I think we've seen enough. And like that's the last line of the movie and then everything.
Is that really the last
like,
line of the movie?
I think that might be it.
Oh, that shows how memorable that is to me.
And then they just kind of pan out. They show that spooky house and then like it's over.
They show the murder house. Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, what I love about that shot at the end is that it does show you the path of that tornado. Like it shows
Yes.
you how big and how wide. And I always wonder, like, how did they capture that shot? Like, how did they do that? That's very impressive to me. I think it's kind of the effects that are involved there or how they did that. But I think there is a certain lack of closure, I think, to me overall. It's like we just did it, and I don't see what the end result is of
That's
the
where
effort.
my mind
like,
goes
I got
to.
the data.
Yeah.
Like, we got it,
Yeah.
and that's supposed to be enough for me. I'm
We don't,
almost
we
looking...
don't see the payoff. We don't see the payoff of the warning system. We don't see like it would have been because multiple times throughout the movie they try to make an homage to this opening scene and make these parallels of like, oh, we've got this farmer and his wife in the nightgown in a little town and the little girl that she keeps looking back at Joe as they're driving through. And then even the resemblance of that family at the last farm where the F5 goes through, right? So it's
who
like
survived, even though they did not have any warning.
they did not
right?
have
Yeah.
warning.
Do you
but
need the
it
system?
would be awesome. Like for me, it would be like, oh, you don't have to explain how we got the warning system, but just you have
Having
a family
some sort of reference or
yeah.
closure of like, we did
Yeah.
the thing we intended to do. We got
Yeah.
the results that we wanted, and I can appreciate
Because the
maybe...
ending that they gave made it almost feel like the romance was the more important resolution
That's the kicker.
rather than the purpose that drove them into that twister in the first place.
Yep.
So yeah.
We've accepted that we're getting back together. We're going to kiss in the convenient water that has made its way here on the set. That is absolutely the kicker for me. It feels like
Yeah.
a little bit of like a weird turn of, oh, the relationship that we were pursuing all. Like, no, you weren't.
Yeah.
You want to create a system, save lives. That's what matters here. Yeah, very well captured there. That's it. Well, Simon, all good things must come to an end, including this episode.
Thanks again for joining us for episode 13. We hope it's been a fun one for you. But our greatest desire is that this is doing for you what it's doing for us, shaping the way we watch movies and sparking spiritual conversations around them.
And we'd love to keep the conversation going with you because we know there are all sorts of other good stories and awesome nuances to explore in the movie Twister. And you can track us down and talk about your thoughts, insights, questions, or maybe your favorite debris from the movie on Instagram at All Good Stories Podcast. We would love to keep the conversation going and keep learning with you.
And remember, all good stories belong to Jesus.
And if you choose to give your story to Jesus, you can be sure he'll make it a good one.